What's going on, guys? Welcome back to WWE Network and Show, where I, Graham G. Matthews, break down all the original content you watch on the WWE Network, on Peacock, and on Vice. As today we're talking Season 3, Episode 7 of The Dark Side of the Ring on the Dynamite Kid. Now, this does wrap up the first half of Season 3 for the show. I think the second half comes back a little bit later on in the year. I'm not sure when that is, whether it be in the fall or at the end of the summer. I don't know. But it's been a good, solid first half of Season 3. Maybe not the best season so far. There's been a lot of good episodes. I struggle to say, like I said last week, that like the Grizzly Smith, for example, episode was good just because it was so goddamn horrifying and disgusting at several points. But this was kind of very similar. Thankfully, it didn't deal with the same sort of issues, but still very depressing to say the least. Side story for me, real quick, as it regards to the Dynamite Kid. Obviously, I never grew up watching the Dynamite Kid. I didn't get into wrestling until a lot later than when he retired decades ago. I almost had the interview, or rather the opportunity to interview the Dynamite Kid about 5 years ago. There was this wrestling documentary that was out. I was approached about interviewing talent from the documentary. I got to talk to Diamond Dallas Page about it around that same time. Before I could talk to Dynamite, who obviously I knew who he was, but I wasn't like overly enamored with his work, and I was awaiting this amazing opportunity to talk to Dynamite because I had heard stories about how he was and why he was so disenchanted with the business now and whatever. Still, I had the opportunity. I was going to do it, and things kind of fell through, to say the least, before it can kind of come to fruition. That's another story for a different day, but I almost did have the chance to talk to Dynamite Kid, and then the kind of opportunity fell away from me for a variety of reasons, for stuff that really wasn't my fault. But again, that's a different story for a different day. Let's get into my review right now of Dark Side of the Ring, the Dynamite Kid. And there's a lot of notes I took down here. Try to stay with me. There's a lot of people they interviewed. They talked to the former wife of Dynamite Kid. I don't know if they actually ever got divorced before he died. I assume they did. They never actually said that, but he left back for England at one point, leaving her after she told him to get the fuck out. So she never said, I don't think, unless I missed something, that they filed for a divorce. Otherwise, I feel like if they were still together, then they would have called her a widow, which they weren't. They hadn't seen each other for many years before he died a few years ago. So I'm just going to go ahead and assume that's his ex-wife. But we hear from her. We hear from two of his daughters. We hear from Jacques Rougeau of the Fabulous Rougeaus in WWF. We hear from Dan Spivey, who I didn't even recognize, the former Dan Spivey character. And wasn't that Waylon Mercy from many, many years ago in WWE? But yeah, we hear from him. He was almost unrecognizable. A close friend of Dynamite's named Gary Potts. We hear from him. Mick Foley, kind of talking from the fan perspective, among other people. We also hear from Lance Storm at the very beginning of the episode. And I think this was the only time we hear from Lance Storm. So we hear from him in the opening minute of the episode, kind of detailing what the show is going to be about. But beyond what we hear from him after the intro, that's really all that we hear from Lance Storm, if I recall correctly. But he says that Dynamite Kid's impact on the industry was gigantic and largely a positive one inside the squared circle. Beyond it is a different story that we're going to get into. But largely, inside the ring, he left a very positive impact. And he kind of started that faster-paced wrestling back in the 80s and was kind of responsible for that whole wave of generation of wrestlers for people that would soon follow before it became the new in thing in 2021. He was doing it 30 years ago. Like I said, we hear from Michelle Billington, the former wife of Dynamite Kid, as well as Julie Hart. That was another talking head I forgot to mention. She is the now ex-wife of Bret Hart. And she is also the sister of Michelle, which I didn't know, so I thought that was interesting. She first saw Tom, Michelle did, while watching Tom's matches with Bret Hart many, many years ago. And that was when they kind of got familiar with each other. She recalls like their first romantic date out in the snow, walking out in the snow, and just thought, just completely thought of him like a Prince Charming at that point. They got married when she was 18 years old. She reads off a letter here that Tom wrote her, I guess soon after they got married, probably when he was off wrestling somewhere, about why, how he wanted kids and all this other stuff and not wanting to force her into it. It sounds like he was two totally different people at the beginning of their marriage and then later on. It wasn't like he was this evil person all along that he was just simply hiding from Michelle. I guess it was the drugs, among other things, and obviously the injuries as well, kind of mounting up, that changed him into this completely despicable, evil, disgusting person. We hear from Bronwyn, if I'm saying that correctly. I know it looks like brownie on the page because I fucking love brownies, but her name is spelled Bronwyne. Bronwyn, I believe, is how you pronounce her name. They said it several times in the episode. I'm terrible with pronunciation, but I'm pretty sure that's how you pronounce it. That is his oldest daughter. She is the oldest daughter of Tom Billington, a.k.a. the Dynamite Kid. She recalls playing in the ring that he had in his backyard when she was a kid and kind of growing up around wrestling. She used to go to the shows and hang out with Randy Savage and Elizabeth, and a lot of cool photos shown at that point in the episode. And he could tell, or rather she could tell from the pictures that she has seen with, her dad from when she was a kid, and even her own memories of her dad from when she was a kid and how he always wanted to hold her and stuff like that, that he really, really loved her. And even Michelle had said that, he never actually held, I think it was Bronwyn, or maybe it was another one of his other kids. He never wanted to hold the kids until they were not fully grown, but at least a couple of months, if not a year, until they could walk, because he never wanted to drop them. So he obviously really cared about his kids. Amaris is the youngest daughter. Again, I'm not sure if that's how you pronounce it. Amaris was their youngest daughter. So we hear from more about his in-ring career and how he became one of Stampede Wrestling's top performers. But it was really after he left there and went to Japan that he made a name for himself, specifically in the series of matches he had with Tiger Mask, widely regarded as some of the greatest of all time. We hear from Dave Meltzer, who was another talking head on this episode. So if you're not a Meltzer fan, you're going to hate his fucking involvement on this episode, because we hear from him quite a bit when it comes to his career. But Meltzer notes that he paved the way for guys like Jushin Thunder Liger in the ring, Chris Benoit in the ring, and it was evident at that point, even from watching those matches, he had no regard for his body whatsoever. So that led him to WWF around 1984 in the early 80s, and it was around that time that he started doing steroids to undergo this physical transformation, because he was on the smaller side and he wanted to be bigger and stronger and fit in with the land of the giants that was WWF at that point, so he started doing the roids. We hear from Dan Spivey, who was a friend of Dynamite at that time, and said at that point when he got into WWF, the guy was just pure muscle. We hear from Gary Potts, who was a close friend of Dynamite. His wrestling name was Scott McGee. And they talk about how at that point, backstage in wrestling, and specifically in WWF, guys were giving each other shots of the roids. They were fucking shooting each other in the ass with these needles and whatever. We hear from Jacques Rougeau, of course, of the fabulous Rougeau brothers. And he talks about the Bulldogs and the impact that they had on him when he came into the company, and more on that a little later. And he remembers seeing a needle sticking out his frickin' ass when he was walking in the locker room one day. Dynamite, that is. Jacques remembers Dynamite walking into the locker room with a needle sticking out of his ass because they were doing roids at that point. So the Bulldogs win gold at WrestleMania 2. Great moment. Mick Foley talks about how Dynamite was a product of the Snake Pit Wrestling Club growing up, and that's how he kind of got into wrestling. I wish they had mentioned that. They didn't do a whole, this is where he was born, and this is who his parents were. They kind of just started from, when he met his wife and stuff like that. So there's a lot of things we learn about his upbringing that we find out over the course of the episode, which I guess is a little different, and it kind of switches up the formula a little bit. But we find out here that he was a product of, again, the Snake Pit Wrestling Club, per Mick Foley. And that was where he had the crap completely kicked out of him. And that's where he kind of learned to be this hard-hitting performer and really beat the shit out of people in matches. Mick Foley mentions this because he had one prior match before making, I believe it was his WWF debut. I think it was for an untelevised match, but I don't remember. But his name was Jack Foley at that point. It was the tag team match. He said, again, he had one prior match before that, and the match was against the British Bulldogs. And, it was an honor for him to be in there with them and really learn something in one of his first few matches in the business. But, halfway through the match, he dislocates his jaw after Dynamite hits him with a clothesline. Extremely hard, right on the bicep. Completely unnecessary. And he fucks up his jaw. He couldn't eat hard food for 3 weeks, he said. Went home right afterward after thanking them for the match and saying it was an honor to be in the ring with them. Went home and threw up. I mean, that was his memory of working with the Dynamite Kid. He was just unnecessarily physical, more physical than he needed to be. Just dangerous, and not because he wasn't good, but because he was just he was trying to be a tough guy and just be this asshole inside the ring, and it was just completely unnecessary, like I said. They talk about how he would put, sleeping drugs in people's drinks and, oh, just fucking weird. After the daughters show off like his attire and how cool his in-ring attire was, we hear all these stories from Spivey and people like that and Gary about how he was putting pills in people's drinks, like sleeping drugs, to play jokes on him. And he thought of it as a joke, and he would like shave guys' heads and, fucking beat the shit out of them and stuff like that. He thought it was funny, but it wasn't a joke when you're on the road, as Jacques Rougeau said, when you're on the road for 3 weeks and you haven't seen your kids in 3 weeks and you lost your bags at the airport earlier on in the week. Like, it's not a joke at that point. And the ex-wife Michelle had said that he wasn't like that early on in their marriage. He only really got like that and became more sadistic and started doing dumb shit like that after his back operation. So that's when we find out that he had a match in Canada, I believe, in Ontario, and he had to be rushed to the hospital because he had a back injury just doing a simple drop down, fucked up his back, had to be rushed to the hospital during a match, I believe in 1986, if I'm not mistaken. This is while he was still in WWF as one half of the tag team champions with Davey Boy Smith. So because his back was so messed up, they were like bulging, just his back was essentially mangled. He had to have 2 discs, herniated discs removed from his neck. And he got back in the ring 2 weeks later when he was obviously strongly advised against it. I think they may have told him you can never wrestle again or you can't wrestle for a long time. He was back in the ring 2 weeks later. So Vince let him go back in the ring. Maybe he didn't know the extent of his injury. I would assume that he did, but he didn't have him wrestle per se. He had the Bulldogs go out there for a match, and Dynamite was attacked right out of the gate. So Dynamite was attacked, which led to Davey Boy working the entire match and dropping the tag titles to the Hart Foundation. Whereas you could have just taken the belts off of him without them actually losing them, considering how messed up he was physically, but they didn't give a shit at that point, and Dynamite wanted to do it. And Gary talks about how Dynamite, after the match or later on or whatever, he was sleeping on Gary's floor at several points, not because he had to, but because he wanted to, because that was what was most comfortable for him. He would wake up and hear like this whimpering noise from Dynamite from where he was sleeping, like he was in that much pain at that point. And he really rushed his in-ring return a lot sooner than he should have. Michelle tells a story about how they went to the bar one day and she didn't want to drink, and he was forcing her to drink, and she got a drink that looked like a drink, even though it was like a tonic water or something like that. He takes the drink from her, drinks it, spits it out, and says, "What is this shit? Like, what is this garbage?" And she says, "Oh, it's an tonic water." And he goes, "No, I want you to drink." And he was all fucking pissed at her to the point where he was playing chicken on the road, which is essentially, I guess, you drive at people and pretend you're going to hit them when you don't, which is fucking crazy. Maybe he was drinking and driving. I don't know. I would assume so, based off his behavior here. Went home and was still so fucking pissed at her that he woke her up in the middle of the night and threw her in the closet and said, "This is where you're going to sleep tonight." And that's where she slept. Like, that's how crazy and fucking messed up this guy was at that point. And she got pregnant right afterward. And they had an impatient child. I forgot the name of the kid. But he was really impatient. But Tom tried his best to be patient with their newborn baby. And he was really trying to make up for his bad behavior. But that wasn't it. So he took out his rage one day. And apparently this is a famous story. I don't know if I've ever heard this before. He took out his rage on the Rougeaus. They had a tag team match. And the match went to a draw. And Jacques thought it was a great match, and he liked the Bulldogs, and he thought that, he had no heat with Dynamite or the Bulldogs or whatever. And apparently, according to Michelle, because Tom was talking to Michelle about how the Rougeaus were brought in with a lot of prestige right off the bat, Tom wanted them to earn their right to have privilege in the company. So he planned to just kind of initiate them from the get-go. And when I say them, more so Jacques. I don't know about the other Rougeau brother, but definitely Jacques. So Jacques was called into the locker room one day by Mr. Perfect, who wanted to play cards with him. Jacques couldn't resist because he loves playing cards. He knew him very, very well, did Perfect apparently. So Perfect calls him over to play cards, and he was probably in on it because he was up against the wall on the other side of the locker room. And while he was making his way over to Perfect, Jacques got ambushed from behind by Dynamite, by Tom. So he just beats the shit out of him, whacks him in the back of the head, punches the fucking shit out of him to the point where he couldn't eat for a long time. Didn't even want to shave and look himself in the mirror. That's how bad he was. He was in a really bad way. And Jacques, kind of retelling this story, says he was kind of more messed up emotionally than he was physically. He was more messed up mentally than he was physically for a really, really long time. And it was at that point he wanted the plan to get revenge. So before going to a show one day, he talked to his dad beforehand, and his dad told him, go to the bank, get a roll of quarters, hit him with that. And he was already planning to get revenge anyway, but that's what the dad suggested. So the dad of Jacques was kind of antagonizing him and kind of just egging him on to beat the shit out of this guy by suggesting that he get a roll of quarters, which he did. So he got to the show, waited for Tom to arrive at the show, waited him to arrive at the arena. Sees him backstage. He goes, "Hey, Dynamite, how you doing?" He had a cup of coffee in his hand, did Dynamite, kind of, put his head back, had a smile on his face, probably like a piece of shit that he was at that point, and Jacques just fucking clocked him with those roller quarters. Gary believes that it wasn't a roller quarters, it was fucking brass knuckles, because he fucked this guy up. He punched him right in the mouth, knocked out 4 teeth, blood spewing out like a horror movie, according to Jacques. And obviously, he's probably exaggerating a little bit, because he was the one that did it, and he was proud of it, he was laughing about it, telling the story here. And he's like, listen, if you ever try to fucking mess with me again, next time you'll be in a wheelchair. And Tom was swearing and he was freaking out about it, blah, blah, blah. Gary didn't think it was justified. Michelle didn't think it was justified. What Tom did to Jacques didn't warrant what Jacques did to Tom by punching his lights out and knocking out 3 teeth. Tom, after that, bought a 9mm handgun because apparently Dino Bravo told him that the Mafia knew where they lived and he had pictures of their home and their family, and Tom was really fucking, freaking out about this, thinking that the Mafia, because Dino Bravo was involved with them, as we know from the first season of Dark Side of the Ring. Maybe it was the second season. Yeah, it was the second season of Dark Side of the Ring that they talked about Dino Bravo. They tie in a lot of different Dark Side of the Ring episodes with this one, including Chris Benoit, which came a little bit later on. And apparently Dino said that, you should probably move, which they did. And Foley said he was never the same guy after that. So Jacques tells his side of the story here, and maybe he's told this elsewhere. I don't know if this is new information. But he knew, he kind of laughs about the whole Mafia thing, which he says isn't true. Well, he is responsible for it, but here's what happened, he said. He knew that Bravo was a stooge for the Bulldogs. He didn't like Dino Bravo, but he knew him as a stooge for the Bulldogs. And he knew that anything that he would say, Dino would take back to Tom. So what happened was this. He wrote on a piece of paper a fake name and a fake number, and he gave it to Dino. And he said, he told Dino Bravo, I got to call this guy once a night, every night, and if I don't, things are going to get taken care of. So then Dino brings that to Dynamite, and that was why Dynamite/Tom thought that the Mafia was coming after him because of what Dino said. And I would love to hear the wife's reaction on that, because we don't get to hear her reaction to Jacques' story. She just said that she was sick of hearing it before she even told her side of the story. And she was done of fucking hearing about it and all this other stuff, like, is that the only thing people are ever going to remember about, my ex-husband? Which clearly she still has a lot of love for him, despite all the stupid shit that he did. Because she defended him a lot during this episode. Despite, telling the truth and all the abuse that she went through as well. So we find out that he leaves, does Dynamite, WWF, after Survivor Series 1988. Meltzer said that he was never happy there. He went back to Japan. And it was evident, it actually wasn't evident during that tour of Japan that he was hurting a lot. His body was in a lot of pain. But it wasn't evident because he was working as if nothing was wrong, because he still gave it 100%. So apparently at that point, he kind of was like, my shoulder's bothering me. They find out soon after, did he and his wife, that his ligaments weren't even on the shoulder bone, which is disgusting. So he had to wear a sling, and he and Michelle got in a fight, and he took off his sling and really messed up his recovery, fucked up his arm because he took off the sling, and Michelle's freaking out. Why the hell would you do that? We hear from Julie again for the first time in a while, and she said that her last memory of Tom was him inviting her over to his house. And I thought this would end poorly, but it was actually just really weird. He invited her over to his house to just watch wrestling with her, like matches that he had with Tiger Mask and how his glory days essentially were, and just kind of watching all these great matches that he wanted to show her. And they watched it for hours, and that was her last memory of him, because that was the last time I think that she saw him. So they tell another story about how he came back to the house on New Year's Eve in 1990 with blood on his sweatshirt. He was wearing a white sweatshirt, blood all over it. The kids were freaking out. Bronwyn, I always forget how you pronounce the name exactly, was scared about what had happened to him. She's like, why do you have blood all over your sweatshirt, Dad, and blah, blah, blah. And she was freaking out, and Michelle was trying to calm her down and all this other stuff. So she knew enough was enough. She was fed up with his bullshit. She went out, bought a one-way ticket to England to give to him, and told him basically to get the fuck out. She said, listen, go get what you need from the house, and just get out of here, please. He was pissed. I don't know if he ripped up the ticket. I wouldn't be surprised. So what happened was, he doesn't beat her up, basically, but he grabs her by the hair, drags her across the floor. I mean, this is just getting very dark before we even go any further. Had her in like a wrestling hold that basically dislocated her jaw, and after he let her go, she kind of like put it back in place, she said, which is disgusting. She's like, just get the fuck out of here. You're getting out of my house. And he said, no, why don't you get the fuck out of here? And she was like, no, like, I'm the one that's pregnant. I'm the one that has toddlers to take care of. Like, no, you get out of here. You're the problematic one. So he leaves, goes downstairs, comes back with a gun, and aims it right at her head and said, listen, you're going to get out of here. I don't care if you're pregnant. Just get out of here, and threatens to shoot her if she doesn't. And she knew that he wasn't going to do it. She was calling him out on his bluff. The kids are freaking out, and she's trying to tell him, like, oh, no, it's fine. Daddy's just being stupid again, blah, blah, blah. She even tried to call the police and was like, listen, my husband is threatening to kill me, and I'm pregnant. Please do something. And apparently, according to her, allegedly, the woman over the phone said, oh, if he's telling you to leave, then it should be okay to leave. So they were clearly no help. And she didn't want to go to Bret Hart and Julie Hart's place, but she knew that she had to. She didn't want to bring her bullshit there. But again, she knew that she had to. And she was scared when she got... I think she brought the kids. I don't remember. Either way, she was just scared that he was going to show up and try to do something to her or do something to Bret or Julie or whatever. It was soon after that Tom just ended up moving back to England anyway. And Michelle had Amaris right after he moved away. And she used that name because it was like... I guess it basically means a promise by God, and she really looked at it as Amaris as like a miracle, and... you know, had she not had her, maybe she would have died, blah, 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 all this other stuff. And she wished that Tom would come and visit, but in retrospect, she's glad that he didn't, because it just would have messed up things even further. Meanwhile, Tom's over back in England, fighting people in garages. That's all he did for money at that point. Never talked about his family to Dan Spivey and people like that, because he didn't want to show weakness. He had that macho side of him. Never talked about his family. He went to Michinoku Pro Wrestling in 1996 for a comeback match. It looked like complete shit. They show footage here. He looked like a shell of his former self. And I don't know if it was in that match that he got injured, but he was doing something where he was pretty fucked up physically. Went to the doctor. It was on his legs where he had an issue, and he just couldn't stand properly. Went to the doctors, and the doctor said, listen, you have too much scar tissue. We can't operate on you. So he ended up in a wheelchair in his 40s. And Michelle never spoke ill of him to her kids and only spoke highly of him, even though they had never met him or had not seen him in a long time. She never spoke of like the negative stuff, specifically Amaris, who had never met her own father before. But she became pretty open up. She kind of opened up about it after the Chris Benoit stuff in 2007, and there was a lot of documentaries and news reports going around about wrestling and the expose of that shit with all the concussions and all this other garbage, and she became really open about the abuse that she endured up to that point, and told the kids about it the night before. Amaris was pissed at her mom for lying to her, and at her dad for all that he had done to his mom for just being, she was the absolute sweetest woman, according to Amaris, and she was pissed that, that he would do all this stuff to his family and his wife at that point and all this other stuff. So Tom never returned to Canada to see his kids or his wife. Bronwyn had a kid at that point. She had basically all but grown up. She was pretty much grown at that point, had a kid and everything, but she still felt empty and realized that emptiness inside of her was because she was missing her dad. So she wanted to go visit him, asked Amaris to go with her, and she said no, absolutely not. I'm fucking pissed at him. Obviously, Bronwyn had known her father, met her father, had recollections and memories of her father. Amaris didn't, had only heard the negative stuff after the Benoit incident. So, went to go visit him. And he had no idea that she was coming. She just kind of, not like surprised him. I don't know if that's the right word to use, but she just really wanted to go see her dad and went to go see him without him knowing. And the first thing that she saw was him sitting in a wheelchair. And she immediately broke down, seeing her father in a wheelchair, just broke her heart. And he acted like no time had passed. And he's like, why are you crying? And she's like, oh, I haven't seen you in 15 fucking years. And she wanted to be close to him, and she was there for a couple days, so she kind of like went up next to him and held his hand, and they locked up hands, and they cried together, and he said that he was sorry. And she said that was the only time she ever heard her father apologize for anything that he did. Come to find out that he was very sick towards the end of his life. I think that was the last time that she saw him, and she was really glad that she went. I don't think Amorous ever met her father before he died. But, yeah, so he was very sick before he died. He had a stroke. Spivey gets emotional talking about him and says that he cared about him and he misses him very much. Bronwyn said that she didn't cry for a week after he died because she was just in shock. And all Amorous ever wanted was just to be beside him, was to have her father beside her. And that just never really came to be. And she was consoling her mother over the phone after it happened. And then it was at the end of the phone call that the mom said, Michelle said, that now he's going to be beside you forever or whatever. And that really hit home for her and got her really emotional and got her crying and whatnot. And Michelle brings up that you should talk about, when you talk about the negative stuff of Dynamite Kid, that you should also talk about depression. Like, she's sick of people bashing him and all this other stuff she said. And she said, if you do stuff like this, and she's talking about the documentary here, if you're going to do shit like this, then you got to talk about the depression that he went through. You got to talk about the CTE, and you can't knock him. I mean, she's right, but at the same time, like, you got to take fucking accountability for your actions. He did a lot of vile, stupid, and evil shit, especially to her. And just because, she's not excusing it, but because she says, oh, you got to talk about that, you can't bash the guy. Like, he's a fucking piece of shit. Like, you have every right to bash him. And I don't think this Dark Side of the Ring went out of their way to bash him. They were simply telling the story of what the fuck happened. You know, it wasn't a hit piece. It was a lot like the Warrior one, where they praised him for being a great father and a great guy early on before roids really just got the worst of him and really changed his life and made him into this asshole. You can't blame CTE and depression forever. Then clearly that shit that he endured. But it was his own undoing by being in the ring all the time and really pushing his body to 130% every fucking match, not taking care of himself and stuff like that. So he is to blame as well. I mean, it's not just the CTE and the concussions and shit like that. I mean, it was his choice to do the roids, no matter how much peer pressure he was under at that point. But I digress. She believes that he could have come back, and she does say that the kids were better off without him around, and she never really understood why he felt like, oh, I want my kids to be proud of what I did in the ring. And she's like, listen, they don't need a wrestler in their lives. They need a father. And now she realizes a lot later in her life that all he wanted to do was do something that his kids were proud of, that being his matches and being this great wrestler. And now she finally appreciates that side of his life for what it was, as well as the kids. And they seem to be pretty, not high on their father, obviously, but they seem to recognize the impact that their father left on the business, for whatever the hell that's worth. And we hear from Foley at the very end here, who says that he's largely been forgotten. I mean, he only died a few years ago, but you never really hear about Dynamite Kid. Obviously, he never came back to WWE, was never really involved with wrestling at all up until his death for decades and decades. And he won't be the last one. He quotes Bruce Springsteen by saying that, remember what the artist did, or remember the art of the artist and not the artist themselves, or something along those lines. Honor the art and not the artist, because a lot of these people that are great at what they do have a lot of personal issues too, he being chief among them, at least as far as the wrestling world goes. And Foley said that he won't be the last to suffer for the sake of his art. And it was a good episode, very fucking depressing if you don't know that much about his personal life, which I didn't. And a lot of this has probably been told before, specifically the Rougeau stuff. I knew nothing of this, so I thought it was very interesting. A very sad way to end this first half of the season. Like, the Warrior one kind of had to happen. I mean, it didn't. He died, actually, but I'm trying to think. I mean, the Grizzly Smith one was just disgusting, but, like, the family grieving and moving on from it seemed to be somewhat of a happy ending. Brian Pillman's son, Brian Pillman Jr., having success following his father's death is kind of a happy ending. This one doesn't really have a happy ending. He fucking died. He was a piece of shit. And that's really about it. Bronwyn kind of reunited with him, had that moment with him before he died, but again, that's really about it. But that was this episode of Dark Side of the Ring, Season 3, Episode 7 on the Dynamite Kid. Definitely check it out on Vice. A great inside look at who Dynamite Kid was in the ring, as well as outside of the ring specifically, because it is the dark side of the ring after all, and the impact he left in the business, and the impact he left on a lot of other people for stuff he did not do inside the ring, for better and mostly for worse. Be sure to like this review. I would appreciate it. Be sure to drop a comment on the video, share the video, and subscribe to the channel for more daily content. And hit the bell button to be notified every time a new video goes up. So like I said, this is it for the first half of Season 3 for Dark Side of the Ring. We'll be back whenever new episodes start airing again, whenever that might be, whether it be later in the summer, it might be in the fall, it might be in the winter. I'm not exactly sure. Hopefully it's on the sooner side because I really enjoy this show. And it's become a great weekly tradition to be watching it and enjoying it. And I really like this episode too. So be sure to check out all my other Dark Side of the Ring reviews from Season 1, 2, and Season 3 in the description box down below. And in the absence of this review, of these reviews of Dark Side of the Ring, you can also check out the low-key reviews coming here to the channel. The first one went up on Friday of last week, and we're going to try to get those up on Friday every week. So check out the low-key reviews from Disney+. I'm also breaking down every single week, every new content that goes up on Peacock and the WWE Network, whether that's Icons or 24s or Chronicles or Untolds or whatever it might be. There's a new Nexus Untold that's supposed to come out that I don't know when it's coming out. I thought it was supposed to be out like a week or two ago, or this past week, or this coming week, and I haven't heard anything, so I'm not exactly sure yet. But Broken Skull Sessions I break down as well, so check out all that other stuff here on Network and Chill. I would greatly appreciate it. Have an awesome one, guys. I'm Graham G.S. Matthews, and I'll catch your ass down the road.